on my uni holidays that I went to San Francisco. And so I hadn't left med school, hadn't really made any big leaps or anything, but I sort of ran the process simultaneously. But it was only once I'd been to San Francisco, sort of spent a year almost working on this problem, speaking to customers, building out prototypes, doing it as a side project, that it became really clear, like, wow, like no one is tackling this problem from a patient perspective. There's a huge gap, there's a huge market, and we saw some sort of traction. And that's when I started raising around, actually. And it was when we first got sort of traction in that round that I had to make the decision, because I was still over in the States. Uni was starting that year. I needed to be back in January, and I had to make a call, like, do I defer, or do I sort of pause this cap raise, forget about it, come back to it when I finished med school?
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 136 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to have Manuri Gunawardena, the founder and CEO of HealthMatch, as my guest for this episode. Manuri launched HealthMatch in 2017 as a way for patients to gain access to clinical trials. And the business has gone through incredible growth since then, particularly this year, where they've grown from a team of 5 to 20 and from 8,000 users at the end of May to over 80,000 by the end of the year. As Manuri also announced on this podcast, HealthMatch raised $18 million in Series B funding, led by SquarePeg Capital, taking their total funding to date to $25 million. We covered a range of topics in this interview, including the importance of building credibility through domain expertise, particularly for non-technical founders, the importance of having a clear North Star mission, why and how Manuri looks for horsepower during the hiring process, how to get buy-in from large-scale enterprises and investors through effective storytelling, and much more. Without further ado, here is my interview with Manuri Gunawardena. Manuri, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show this morning.
Thanks very much for having me.
So Manuri, for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the founder and CEO of HealthMatch. We're a platform that connects patients to clinical trials. And I guess to give context to, how I came to sort of working on this problem and building HealthMatch is, a couple of years ago, I was in a very different world in med school, essentially researching brain cancer, really interested in this space. And one of the things I was working on in my last couple of years was a clinical trial vaccine for brain cancer. And we were trying to find patients for this trial. And we only got 2 patients in all of Australia. And it was because they happened to know the right neurosurgeon. And I thought that was really bizarre, especially given the fact that people are willing to travel all around the world to access treatments. And it became really apparent that in the context of clinical trials and getting access to the latest treatments, it was really dependent on which clinician you knew or which hospital site you were visiting as a patient as to whether you got access. And then, over the course of sort of getting really, really fascinated by how would a patient actually be able to access these trials and why are we struggling, realize that recruitment for clinical trials is such a massive space and problem. The industry really struggles with finding the right patients. And I think all of us would have seen the context behind that this year with COVID-19 and the vaccine trials that everyone's trying to expedite. But, imagine that for oncology or chronic conditions where people are looking for new cures and treatments, and they're really, the biggest hurdle is the fact that operationally we can't actually run a smooth process in clinical trials and find the right patients. So yeah, got really interested in the problem, met a few people that had left the healthcare world and sort of entered tech, and did TechCrunch a couple of years ago, went to Silicon Valley and really caught the bug, met some inspiring people and thought, yeah, why don't we try and tackle this problem?
Yeah, I mean, obviously such a big problem, and, obviously kind of really brought to the forefront given everything that's happened this year. But, I guess just going back, you kind of mentioned that you were in medical school, and to my understanding, you were sort of 5 years in when you decided to jump out and follow HealthMatch. What was that process like for you? Like, I'm sure that there's quite a few founders or future founders that are listening to the show have this idea, but there's kind of almost this sunk cost of things that they feel that they've spent a long time studying or have spent a really long time in industry. It can be really hard to understand when's the right time to go and pursue an idea. What was that process like for you in terms of, I guess, giving up 5 years of study and then having this path laid out in front of you to then going, actually, I'm going to try and start my own thing instead?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think most important thing to say is like I didn't make the decision sort of straight away and kind of go like this is an interesting idea, let's pursue it. And like you said, there's a huge sunk cost. Like most of the last 10 years I can remember, I really wanted to do neurosurgery and follow this path. So I was really stuck on and kind of going down that path. But I think for me, it was, after seeing the problem, starting to sort of spend some time in it, investigate. I sort of did it as a side project to my research year. I actually found lab work pretty boring, so I had some spare time to kind of look at this problem. And then over the course of the year, started reading books like, 0 to 1 and The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and learning about what MVPs were and prototypes, and coincidentally sort of had the guys from TechCrunch come out and sort of did this pitch, and it was from there that on my uni holidays that I went to San Francisco. And so I hadn't left med school, hadn't really made any big leaps or anything, but I sort of ran the process simultaneously. But it was only once I'd been to San Francisco, sort of spent a year almost working on this problem, speaking to customers, building out prototypes, doing it as a side project, that it became really clear, like, wow, like no one is tackling this problem from a patient perspective. There's a huge gap, there's a huge market, and we saw some sort of traction. And that's when I started raising around, actually. And it was when we first got sort of traction in that round that I had to make the decision, because I was still over in the States. Uni was starting that year. I needed to be back in January, and I had to make a call, like, do I defer, or do I sort of pause this cap raise, forget about it, come back to it when I finished med school or whenever? And I sort of thought, look, like, have spent enough time on it. I really believe in this. Like, let's just take the leap. So I think, it was cautioned in a way. Like, I still spent a year or so working on the problem before making the leap, because it is a hard thing to sort of do. And I think at the time when I made it, I didn't know how long I'd be sort of leaving med school for anything. And now it's like 3 years of deferring, and I haven't looked back. So yeah, I think the advice would be, try to figure out the problem, spend some time on it. And then, if it really is an opportunity, I think I'd highly encourage people to take a chance and have a look at solving it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think, running a business is stressful enough, having to figure a lot of those things at the very early stages out while trying to balance like finances and everything is really, really challenging as well. So I completely agree with you in terms of, starting off as a side hustle or trying to spend some time in doing the research instead of going from 0 to 100 really quickly at the very early stages. But again, I guess for the benefit of anyone that's kind of at that stage at the moment, you mentioned that, you spent that year kind of doing research and looking for things. Was there any particular things that you were looking for, any things in particular that like helped build your conviction that actually I do want to defer uni and I do really want to pursue this?
Yeah, I think, I saw the problem from a patient's perspective, as well as sort of an individual research perspective. So I knew the market from that angle, like we were running trials, but it was just one trial, right? So it could have just been bad luck that we didn't find patients for it. And then in clinic, likewise, so I just started expanding that, like speaking to more people running trials, speaking to more patients, trying to get like on the ground. I think the problem in healthcare is a lot of people forget about the patient. Like a lot of solutions are for, industry and pharma or for clinicians. And at the end of the day, like healthcare is so behind in the way that we approach things. Like we're solving a pain point for an end consumer or end patient. Like, how do we make them better? How do we really solve a problem for them? So speaking to patients, it became sort of clear that, it was really like, if they were seeing the right doctor, they got access, but it wasn't a matter of people not wanting to access trials. Like when you think about cancer, the best treatments that are out there for cancer are in the form of clinical trials. They're the latest therapies that, they might take 10 years to be officially approved, but, CAR T-cell therapy for leukemia and stuff, all of that is like, in the process of clinical trials and had been through the process of clinical trials. So I think it was really diving into the problem, speaking to as many people as possible. And then the other aspect was, okay, well, if you're going to solve this problem, like, who are you solving it for, in the sense of like, who pays for it? Like, how do you actually solve a problem in healthcare? And I think a really important thing in the healthcare space is understanding who the payers are and where the dynamics interact in that sort of scenario. And the sponsors of clinical trials, pharma companies, biotechs, when I was doing my research and speaking to some of these customers, like, they spend billions of dollars in R&D and upstream and drug development. And, they've got a limited amount of time to get these drugs and treatments to market before patient runs out and all of that investment doesn't make sense. And they're still blocked from this like really traditional process. So I think for me, like, it was just really getting deep on customers and the market and speaking to people that helped build that conviction.
Yeah. One thing that you sort of touched on a little bit earlier was the TechCrunch Battlefield event. So big shout out to Julia Wells and Marissa Warren as well for bring that event down here. But I was actually at that conference as well. And that was the very first time that I had heard about your HealthMatch. Unfortunately, I didn't see your pitch because I was doing podcast interviews at the conference at that time. But I actually went back and listened to your pitch as well, which I think is available on YouTube. I'll add a link to the show notes.
Oh, wow. But it'd be very different.
Yeah, I mean, like even back then, it was. I think you'd mentioned that you had just launched the product, I think 7 hours prior to the pitch and those sorts of things. Obviously, very, very early stage for you at that time. But what was that sort of process like? Because it was, obviously very early in your journey and trying to tell that story and trying to set that vision. What was that process like in terms of pitching that on stage? And I guess, following on from winning that competition, I think you won 25K as a result. What was that like as I guess a starting point for what HealthMatch is now?
Yeah, I think that competition was really kind of the first introduction to the world of startups and tech for me. And it was learning how to sort of, pitch an idea, like what to speak about, how to sort of frame the problem you're solving. And then it also kind of forced us, as part of the competition, we had to actually have a prototype built. So we built this real like janky prototype that actually like didn't really work properly because we were still trying to figure out how to get the algorithm to work and match patients to it. But it was enough to sort of show the concept. And it was really great. Like, there was some incredible sort of people at that event. I think Mel from Canva was a judge, and I met one of our investors, Anton from WhatsApp, there. And so from that point, like winning the 25K, it was really like, okay, now we've got some sort of basis to go out there and find engineering talent or start building on the prototype. And then spending time in Silicon Valley was really helpful to understand like how other founders have approached building, and especially other non-technical founders.
Yeah, I think at the early stages as well, when, really all you've got is an idea and you don't have a huge amount of traction and you don't have, heaps of funding to I guess, bring people along, having some form of credibility or something that you can kind of point to is really important to just help have that additional, I guess, pull for people. Looking back, how important was it for you, both from an external factor in terms of, I guess, attracting people to be interested in working for you or investing in you, or for yourself personally, was it for you to, I guess, win that TechCrunch Battlefield event?
I think, it's really important. Like, for me, I think as a first-time founder, as someone who's not, a software engineer, it's like, how do you build credibility in this space that you're working in? And for me, it was, having a deep sort of domain expertise in the problem. And, this is a real problem. I've lived and breathed it, understood it, and could field any sort of question left, right, and center about the problem itself. And having like a real crystallized sort of solution and being able to articulate that with the sort of credibility that you bring around the space. Like, I have never built a company before, so I can't really speak to having any form of credibility in that space, but in understanding sort of the path, the mission, the problem space. I think that really helps. So, if you don't have the technical expertise or, the track record of building multiple unicorns before, then, I think having that domain expertise is super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the challenging parts, I assume, about sort of healthcare startups in particular is not a lot of people get the same level of access or insight as you do, as someone who has that kind of deep level expertise. What does that look like when you're trying to convince investors or other people to see how big the potential problem is? Was that a challenging factor at all for you in terms of trying to explain this is what we're trying to do and this is why it's such a big and important problem to solve?
Yeah, I think to a degree there is like a barrier that sometimes might not exist in sectors that are more consumer or more like, most investors get, like fintech, for example. Like healthcare is very specific, and then, we're in a space of like clinical trials, and sometimes every time I have to explain what a clinical trial is, and sometimes I get questions like, but what if they're on a placebo? And it's like, that's not the point. That's not what we're tackling right now. We're tackling how do we get new drugs and treatments to market, and a process that exists and the barriers that exist around that. And I think it's sometimes hard for people coming into a very specific domain to grasp the size of that opportunity and to understand, how big a market is, even though it seems very niche. Like clinical trials seem niche, but it's like a $300 billion market just in recruitment. So it's just being able to take people through that journey. And I think it helps, pattern recognition. So like, being able to reference or have analogies to companies or sectors that people have real familiarity with helps. And then also just speaking to investors that get the space is key. And I think, in Australia, we're really starting to develop that out. But if you go to the Valley, like you've got firms like Andreessen Horowitz that have like a whole, team dedicated to bio and healthcare. And you don't have to explain to them what a clinical trial is and what the opportunity is. They already like know the space. So that really helps.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of investors, I did speak to Alistair Coleman and from Tempest Partners and Paul Bassett from Seek as well, who are two of your investors. And one thing that both of them sort of mentioned about you is that you have a really great ability to storytell. And that's obviously really evident through even your very first pitch from TechCrunch Battlefield. But is there anything in particular that you do? So you mentioned one of the things that you try and do is create analogies that people would be more sort of familiar with. Is there anything else that you do from a storytelling perspective to help make the vision of what you're trying to build a little bit easier for people to digest?
Yeah, I think like trying to take things to a higher level is always helpful, and trying to like, with the team as well, when we speak about the mission and the purpose behind HealthMatch, it's not just like, we're not just recruiting and matching, but like, what is the bigger picture? Like what at the end of the day are we trying to solve that is really going to make an impact? And I think it really helps taking things to a level above and then working backwards and then getting into the detail, because you sort of bring people along for the journey and get people to really understand like end goal, sort of where do we want to be, and then now let's get into the detail sort of thing.
Yeah. How clear was that for you from, I guess, the start in terms of what you wanted to build? So was that vision kind of baked in from day one in terms of what you wanted this to look like? Is that something that's kind of evolved over time? When you talk about sort of, thinking a level above, again, like, was that something that's been kind of very clear from you from day one, or has that sort of picture evolved for you over time?
I think one thing that was really clear was like the problem and what we wanted to tackle there. From day one, it was like, look, there's a huge problem around drug development and the barriers that exist. And I think what has happened over time is more and more opportunities have arisen sort of in that space of drug development. And I think, something that in the last year or two has really crystallized is also the ability for us, like as we build, consumer facing or patient facing platform, we're collecting really great insights to help in, the drug development process and upstream. So I think over time, it's really, I think we always knew like the problem that we wanted to tackle is drug development and improving that process and starting with recruitment, and that there are other opportunities, but over time, those other opportunities have just like crystallized and become more clear as well as we sort of scale.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of scale, you've had a pretty incredible year. You've grown from, I think, 5 to 20 people. And I think the figures that you mentioned to me were, you've grown from 8K users at the end of May to 80,000 users. First of all, what has kind of this year been like for you personally as a founder?
Yeah, it's been such a strange year, like a good year, but very very much like, we did a raise at the end of the last year. We had these plans of scaling, hiring, and the usual, and then then it was really navigating a pandemic and trying to stick to those same plans through that pandemic. So yeah, it's been a great year to be in this space. I think it's really helped contextualize the problem we're solving for a lot of people. And then, yeah, I think being able to hire an incredible team has been one of the key unlockers. Like, we've got some like super talented people from, great brands or companies that have, done it before, and they just bring their expertise to the table. And that's been super valuable for us in terms of growth and, building out the product. So yeah, it's been a strange year, but a good year.
Yeah. I mean, again, one of the people that I mentioned that I spoke to in reference for this interview was Paul Bassett, who was, aside from being one of the founders of SquarePay Capital, was also one of the co-founders of Seek, which is obviously an incredible company built over the last 20 years or so. But one of the things that he mentioned about you and HealthMatch was, and one of his favorite things about you as an investment company, is the culture that you've built at HealthMatch is very similar to what he sort of experienced building Seek as well. Really curious to know, obviously when you've got 5 people that have been sort of working at the problem and are relatively close to the business, it's a little bit easier to kind of bring them in. When you grow from 5 to 20 and there's more people that are new to the business than have been sort of established for a longer time that understand the culture, how do you sort of think about, I guess, maintaining that sort of culture or evolving that over time in a way that maintains that while you sort of continue to grow?
Yeah, I think like super important for me when hiring is like that alignment with mission and values. And I think for us, like, we're working on such like, there's such a clear mission there. And I think people that join also get a real thrill and excitement around seeing that the products that they're working on or the projects that they're working on like deliver like results that are like really exciting. Like, you're literally placing leukemia patients onto trials and giving them access to treatment. So I think that mission really binds the team together. And then I think, going from 5 to 20, we've just been so selective in our hiring. Like, it's just like you want to hire people with like high conviction, alignment to the mission and values, and then just like incredible horsepower. Experience for me is important in certain roles. It's really necessary, but that values piece and the horsepower piece is that it's extremely important to building a great culture. And I think, we have a really like close team. I think everyone enjoys working on the problems that we're solving every day. And I think, we're lucky because the space that we're in, it's interesting problems, and it's great to see the tangible benefits of, solving those problems. So we're just, it's keeping the bar high when recruiting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hiring is, I think, one of the most important things that, I guess separates really good companies from the really great ones as well. Really curious to kind of dig in a little bit into the horsepower piece. Can you share a little bit about what you specifically mean by that?
I sort of, like, it's people that like are problem solvers, people that have a lot of energy. I think you can't really like teach people to have energy, and like in a startup environment, like what we have on our side is speed and ability to execute fast. And you need to have people that can, move at that pace and have that energy and have that ability to ride the ups and downs and know that the environment might be different to any other environment that they've worked in. So having that horsepower and that energy is super important, because we've got, we're the sort of small company coming into an industry, trying to change it and trying to go like global and flip it on its head. So to do that with 20 people, you need 20 people that have like so much energy and are like, coming in every day, like ready to, do like 2 weeks worth of work in one day, or try and, like it's literally like, you're drinking from a fire hydrant when you're building a startup and you're trying to tackle this big problem. So yeah, that's kind of what I mean by horsepower is, energy.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Is there anything in particular that you do to to test that or assess that during the hiring process at all to make sure that you keep that bar really high?
Yeah, I mean, we sort of run a pretty tight process, and part of that is also I like to meet with candidates more than once. I find that, it's helpful sometimes to be able to sort of have that deep dive sort of catch up twice where you can see whether it's just like a one-off, like, this is an interview, I'm going to put my best foot forward, or if this is like a sustained level of like, ability to sort of engage and sort of interact with questions. And then also we run like tasks and various different processes. And I think like making sure that you have a really knuckled down interview process for particular roles is super important, and especially for roles that are technical, and even the non-technical ones, having a task I find is helpful. And if you can come up with a way to create a task for some of those roles, it just shows the way that people interact, when presenting things or when having to ideate things.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. We were touching a little bit on the scale, and obviously growing from 8K to 80K users, which is something that, I think if you offer to most founders, that's exactly the type of thing that they're looking for. But I think with scale comes a lot of different challenges as well in terms of trying to manage that. And some of those are pretty obvious, but to others, it can be a little bit less obvious. We had Simon Griffiths from Who Gives a Crap kind of talking about some of the things that they experienced this year with the pandemic as well. Just really curious from your perspective, what are some of the kind of less common challenges that came from having to scale this year, or some of the things that you went through as a result of everything that's happened over the last few months?
Yeah, it's hard to say whether these are less common challenges or whether everyone sort of faces these. But like for us, I would say like the hardest challenge has been, we did scale the team really fast. We went from 5 to 20, and I think, definitely had more bandwidth than usual. But with that scale came the need for even more bandwidth. As we were thinking about our growth team, like it was so lean. Like we had, a graphic designer and a data analyst in our growth team, and we didn't have a VP of growth, and that's a role I've been looking for. And it's just being able to sort of like maintain that level and keep the sort of pedal down on momentum with having sort of a lean team, because as soon as you go into hiring mode, you kind of like, especially with a smaller team, start to lift the pedal a little bit. So I think for us, like that was a real challenge, and doing that through a pandemic where it's hard to meet people, it's hard to sort of, meet face to face and run interview processes was a bit of a challenge. And then we've also seen product things, like we're now getting sort of inbound requests from customers and patients, and having to keep up. Like before, I think this is also probably part of finding product market fit and stuff, is that we're now getting, demands and requests from users that are enjoying the platform, and trying to keep up with the sort of development and building of that just requires more engineers, and for us to have more resources. So I think that's been like, but that's I'd imagine that's a pretty common problem. I'm struggling to find an uncommon one right now.
One of the things that, again, you've kind of touched on this, is that I think when you're running a company, it can be really overwhelming at times. You're kind of balancing customer needs, product, hiring, potentially fundraising, and all of those sort of things. It can be really, like, your mind can be a little bit all over the place. And one of the things, again, that both Alistair and Paul mentioned that makes you such a great founder is your ability to be really clear in thought. Really curious to know if there's particular things that you do to help that, in terms of just making sure that you sort of retain that sort of level above kind of thinking, or just making sure that you're very clear in how you sort of approach specific problems.
Yeah, I think sometimes I sort of have a reputation for looking like I'm not reacting in sort of a scenario. And I think the thing is I'm actually just processing. Now, like in my mind, I'm like, just taking the time to go, all right, like what are the 1,000 sort of permutations of the way this could go? And oftentimes it usually happens when there's an opinion, or there's sort of a conversation happening where I actually don't have the same opinion as that, as that sort of employee or investor or whoever it is, customer, like, and I actually approached it from a very different angle. And instead of jumping straight in with sort of, hey, like, this is what I think, and this is sort of why, I kind of try and take that sort of time to process and take on their viewpoint. So that's helpful, and it just helps sort of maintain a level of calm. I think the biggest thing is in a startup, like every day is there are so many highs and lows, and so if you can try and build some clarity of thinking by doing that, it's very helpful. I'm not sure how well I do it, but I think it's something I definitely try and actively work towards doing.
Yeah, like I said, something that both of them have mentioned. So clearly it's
Yeah.
something like, is there any particular practice? I mean, again, as you said, a founder journey can be really high and low. Is there any particular things that you do sort of outside of work or habits that you have in place that help keep you sort of level-headed as a founder?
It's kind of hard to think about what I do outside of HealthMatch, although I should probably, find some hobbies outside of HealthMatch. But I think one thing that I really actually enjoy doing is listening to sort of like audiobooks and podcasts and kind of letting my brain drift. And it's really nice sometimes to sort of in the morning be on an audiobook or a podcast and kind of listening to a topic that might be like tangential to sort of something you're working on, but it kind of helps me in a way disconnect, even though it's not really 100% disconnecting. But yeah, I find it interesting sort of learning about other problems and spaces that people are working in.
Any particular audiobooks that you would recommend to founders that maybe aren't necessarily about business?
Oh, that aren't about business. Okay, well,
Or
I think
that are.
the one,
Yeah.
one that I've recently been listening to is Why We Sleep, which is a book written by this professor of sort of neuroscience or sleep science from Harvard, who literally studied sleep for 20 years. And it's like, everyone sort of loves talking about how they got 3 hours sleep and how they've just been hustling and not really sleeping. And I think it's really interesting to dive into a book like that, because it kind of gives you perspective on like why a certain human traits the way they are. And yeah, so it's a really good read for anyone that wants to perhaps get some more sleep or maybe even stress themselves out about not sleeping enough.
Yeah, I think all of us can do with a lot more sleep as well, to be honest. But I guess again, going back to early stages of HealthMatch as well, Alistair Coleman and Tempest were one of the earliest investors into HealthMatch. And when I spoke to Alistair, he mentioned that when he first spoke to you and when they first invested, you were sort of pre-product, pre-revenue, but they really sort of built conviction in you very early on. And one of the things that he mentioned there's a lot of things that he loved about you and the company, but one of the things that really helped him sort of connect to the business was that, as an investor, they meet with 800 companies a year, and the dynamic is very much a particular way in terms of them trying to assess whether the company is the right fit for them. But he mentioned that you were very clear and almost grilled him on why Tempest would be the right partner for HealthMatch as well. And that was something that kind of he really loved in seeing from a founder. Can you talk a little bit in terms of what that sort of fundraising process was like for you very early on, when you don't necessarily have a product and you don't have this amazing traction that you've got now, in trying to convince investors to build conviction?
Yeah, I think, that was an interesting round. I think it was our first like significant round. We did like a 1.3 seed back when it was like pre-product, hadn't really built anything yet. And I think it was really, I think what sort of maybe gave me such like confidence and naivety to go sort of to a VC and as a first time founder and ask them to sort of pitch me was that I think having spent time in the Valley and seeing sort of the way that other founders approach capital raising and approach building a company, and understanding that, if you have conviction in a problem space, you should really be smart about the investors that you bring on, especially in the early days, because those early investors will really be there for the whole journey. And there's some people that can really help shape the trajectory of the company. So, we were really fortunate that some of the angel investors that we had come on early were from like Silicon Valley tech companies. I mentioned WhatsApp earlier, from Google. We had investors from the pharma world who, had deep domain expertise, and that really helped us like in navigating sort of the space while we were building product and while we're sort of scaling. And so I think from a cap raising perspective, like I think finding people that believe in the mission and have high conviction is super important, because it is a long journey, and you've got to have investors that have the same sort of vision and path as you. So yeah, I think that first cap raise was like, I learned a lot about capital raising and sort of how to pitch, and I think somehow struggled my way through it, but we made it out the other end, and then just had enough capital to hire a team in engineering and actually build out the product.
Yeah, I think oftentimes it can be really tempting to just go to all the sources for cash and try and get the funding locked in as quickly as possible. But I think one of the things that you mentioned is really important in terms of thinking about what the structure of that looks like, even at the kind of pre-seed or seed level. What are the different types of investors that you want involved as well, is really important. When you were kind of thinking about putting that together your first round of capital, what were the specific things that you were sort of looking for in the types of people or the types of organizations that you were bringing on board, aside from shared values?
I think in terms of like sort of the earlier investors, it was like, again, outside of shared values, it's like, what sort of coverage can I get in skill sets? I think one thing that I really like to do is I know that I don't know what I don't know, and it's like, surround yourself with great mentors and people that have done it before. So whether it's people that have experience in like product and design and sort of tech expertise, or whether it's people that have experience selling to industry and pharma, I think it was really important to get coverage across the cap table, and so I tried to like not heavily lean towards one or the other, but have every sort of investor bring some form of value that it didn't exist already on the cap table. So yeah, and likewise, when you're talking to VC funds, like other partners you're talking to, do they have experience and skill sets that can help you in that sort of scaling process?
Yeah, that's really important. And obviously that evolves over time as well. When I spoke to Paul, he mentioned that, this was a very atypical investment for them. Usually they like to get to know the founder over a period of sort of 12 to 18 months. Their investment in you was done within 5 days, to my understanding. And part of that was pushed because I think you wanted to close off the round before you got married last year. Congratulations, by the way. But, Squarepeg is kind of known as, being one of the leading investors in Australia as well. And, a lot of companies would love to have them on the cap table. What did that sort of process look like in bringing Squarepeg on board as an investor as well? And I guess pushing them to get the deal done as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think, we kind of, I met Squarepeg sort of late into the process. Like, it was 2 weeks out from the wedding. We're wrapping out the Series A. Already had a term sheet, already sort of had commitment. And I actually had Sick from UpGuard. He actually introduced me to Paul. And I think, it was like, hey, you guys should probably speak to Squarepeg and Paul, great investors. It wasn't really about a Series A necessarily. And I said, look, I'd love to catch up, but we're closing this investment round right now. And can we push a catch up till later? And Paul was like, how about we jump on a call tomorrow? And that's sort of how it happened, and spoke about HealthMatch and the mission. And I think from that first conversation with Paul and Tony, and then later meeting the team, it became really apparent like that these guys were just like high conviction investors. And Paul's experience with Seek, there was so many similarities in terms of how we were thinking about building and scaling HealthMatch that I saw a lot of value in as well. And then yeah, it was really, the timeline was tight. So I think I was kind of like, look, I'm willing to go with this other sort of process. So show me like, like how we're going to work together, and what sort of value that, you guys can bring to the table, as well as like how it will benefit HealthMatch. And I think in the course of 5 days, we went into some pretty deep dives. Like everyone from the Melbourne team flew up and spent time with our team. And yeah, it was a fast process, but I think it, looking back on it, like there were some clear signals as to like why it works really well and that partnership works well. And Paul's been a great investor and, board member for us for the past like year. So good decision, even though it was very quick.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think oftentimes when I think a lot of founders think about fundraising, a lot of it is, what is the information that I need to provide to them? What are the decks that I need to prepare and all those sort of things? Again, one of the things that both Alistair and Paul mentioned is that you're very inquisitive. And that's one of the things that they sort of love about you as a founder and trying to gather a lot of information. And even I think the way that you kind of speak about Tempest and SquarePeg is, really identifying that they were the right partners for you as a business, not just a source of funding as well. For the benefit of kind of anyone that's going through the fundraising process, I guess, what are the types of questions that you ask, or what are the things that you're, I guess, trying to gauge from meetings with investors to identify not just whether they'll kind of give you the capital, but actually will they be the right partners for you for the next sort of 5-10 years and beyond?
Yeah, I think, speaking about how they sort of interact with their portfolio companies and I highly recommend sort of doing founder diligence if possible, like speaking to other portfolio companies that work with these investors. And, like oftentimes you hear stories of like, all this value add and then investors just sort of disappear or aren't super valuable. So I think that's a great way in the same way that if, an investor would sort of be doing diligence on your company and you as a founder, I think it's super important to remember to do it the other way, because then it just helps make sure that the fit is right. And then I think, being able to sort of, I think what's really important and how I sort of look at it is not just by looking at the fund, but looking at the partner that you're going to be working with, because I think that, oftentimes you do get access to the whole fund and the benefits of it, but the partner that invests has a closer relationship, or that's been my experience. So it's like, it's good to be able to align closely with that person and make sure that you pick the right sort of investor from that perspective.
Speaking about fundraising, you had a really big announcement this morning that just broke. Congratulations on your Series B funding round. For the podcast, do you want to share some of the details of your new cap raise?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, as of this morning, just announced the Series B. So we raised 18 mil, and it was led by SquarePeg and Paul, actually. So it was really around, we weren't planning on raising this year, but based off sort of the growth that we've built and the momentum in the product and customers, so it was a great time to double down on the growth and really build out the team. And so, yeah, we had SquarePeg and Tempest follow on. We added some incredible new investors to the cap table. We have the Turnbull family office and Lucy Turnbull joining. She's got great experience across the biotech sector and, also, research institutions like Sydney Children's and the New South Wales Cancer Institute. So that's fantastic having her on board. We also brought on some funds from Singapore and some other high net worths as well. So yeah, I think the capital for us is really to build out the team and double down on product. And it's a good time to sort of be planning for next year and running hard at 2021. So very exciting to have the raise done and have the support of some pretty awesome investors.
Yeah, absolutely. And sounds like a great time to join HealthMatch. So I know that you'll be kind of in hiring mode for the next few months at least. For anyone that wants to jump on board or apply, what's the best way for them to do that?
I mean, if you just jump on healthmatch.io, we have a careers page and an about us page, and we've got a bunch of job ads up and there'll be more and more coming. So feel free to jump on or, just send us an email if there isn't anything up there, because I think, constantly looking for smart people. And so, yeah, reach out. I think we've got big plans around hiring. So, if there's anyone that wants to join the journey, would love to chat.
Perfect. I'll, like I said, I'll make sure that I add that link into the show notes as well for anyone that wants to access that careers page. But I guess just diving a little bit deeper into that sort of fundraising journey, we've obviously spoken about what it was like to kind of raise your first round of capital, going through the Series A process, with SquarePeg. Really curious to know, how does raising, a sizable Series B round differ, or what does a Series B round look like, and how does that compare to raising a seed or a Series A?
Yeah, I think, other than the quantum of capital being sort of bigger and being sort of further along, it's really the milestones that you need to show. I think, seed and Series A, you can sort of be in that pre-product, pre-revenue phase. And then when you sort of come towards later rounds, it's like having a track record of data. And for us, that was having the incredible user base growth and uptake in users, the inbound customers, and starting to generate revenue that really like got us to those milestones. And I think that's really the only difference that I'd see between it. It's just that you have more data points to point to, and it's not just a sort of mission and story anymore. It's like, okay, we're sort of proving we're getting product market fit, and you can sort of see where things are moving towards. So yeah, I think that's really the only difference. And then you're just talking about a large quantum.
Yeah, speaking about, I guess, hitting milestones, when I spoke to Alistair, one of the examples of what it's like working with you as a founder that he mentioned was, I think in a conversation, you had mentioned to him that you wanted Roche as a partner locally, and there was a plan that you had laid out for him in executing over kind of a 3 to 4 month period. And he said almost to the dot, you kind of like came back and told him that you had sort of signed up and executed on that sort of partnership. Can you share a little bit in terms of what does executing against this sort of plan look like? First of all, in terms of setting that as a vision and sort of identifying who the right partners would be, and then going out and bringing on sort of a large scale enterprise to sort of sign off very early on for a company as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know like how to sequence and sort of think about like what are the milestones you need to achieve in order to unlock the next milestones. And for us, like early days, we wanted to bring on customers and partners early on to show that traction and buy-in from industry. And now for us as well, the focus is, okay, like to amplify that buy-in from industry, like we want to like accelerate our user base and really like we're building a marketplace, win liquidity, don't leave any corner of the marketplace unturned, and we do that by delivering value for patients and growing that user base. And I think in terms of like setting a plan, I think you sort of have to map out like who are the customers that you want to win, how do they think about this problem, and then just work backwards. And I think we were lucky in the sense that Roche is a very innovative company, and they partnered very early on with us in terms of not just being a customer, but being a partner and sort of thinking about product development and data and sort of a bigger, and now sort of throughout that organization, we're, working with them in multiple geographies and with their global teams. And I think it was fortunate that we found a customer that could be sort of like one of those early advocates for us. And I think, yeah, it's just set a plan and try and make sure that plan works well with the sequencing. So don't try and do something that doesn't make sense to do right now before you actually, win a user base or win a customer over.
Yeah, I mean, one of the hardest things for especially for relatively early stage companies is trying to get buy-in from enterprise as well. And, again, I keep referencing sort of Alistair and Paul, but again, one of the things that they both mentioned was your ability to sort of open doors, but not just open doors, but really, build relationships or onboard these large enterprises that are difficult at the best of times for even companies that are much further along. Can you share any sort of techniques or strategies or things that you utilize that help you both unlock doors and also get deals like this across the line?
Yeah, I think it's the same sort of skill set as probably being able to bring investors along for the journey or hire great employees. It's like being able to share your vision and sort of probably that storytelling element, like when you're speaking to a large enterprise customer, like articulating that value, but then also bringing them along as a partner and kind of being able to show like that bigger term vision really helps. And we're operating in a space where it's not just large enterprises, it's in healthcare, which is like notoriously slow. So like trying to approach it from a different angle always helps. And I think being able to like show the bigger picture and the story to customers helps unlock enterprises. So and now what we're finding is that story plus the data is helping a lot. So we've got the story now, and now we've got like this incredible sort of growth and real like proof in the pudding. Like we're delivering patients into trials, we're filling cohorts that typically took 24 months to fill. We're doing that in less than a month. So now it's like being compounded by the fact that, hey, we've got this vision and now we've got the data. And so that's really helping unlock more and more of the conversations.
So final question from me before we jump over to audience Q&A as well, because I literally feel like I could talk to you all day about this stuff, Manuri. But yeah, I think storytelling for founders is such an important piece. Obviously, as you mentioned, once you've got that data as well, that really sort of compounds the value. But at the very early stages, all you really have to share is the story of the company. Again, anything that kind of helps you, I think that seems to be a very natural skill that you have, but anything that helps structure that story, refine that story, or just kind of put that in place from the very early stages from, I assume the story that you try and tell investors is very different to the type of stories that you're telling a Roche, for example. How do you think about piecing all of that together when you're speaking to a specific stakeholder?
Yeah, funnily enough, like it actually isn't too dissimilar in terms of what you speak to investors about and customers about, because I think like there is definitely nuances in how you present things. Like if you're speaking to a pharma company versus a patient. But at the end of the day, if you have that core sort of like, the North Star that you're running towards, having one single sort of core North Star actually really helps, because then the way you articulate everything sort of aligns and heads in a similar direction. And so, yeah, I think like, I think having that like single sort of beacon really, really helps in articulating sort of what you're trying to build to different stakeholders, which seems like, it seems weird because like they all have different sort of motivations, but at a higher level, like, we might say to patients, like, you get access to treatments earlier and before they're on market, and this is sort of democratizing that access to you. But our customers also want to know that they're being part of that process, that they're also helping. Like, yes, they're pharma companies, and yes, they're global, drug developers. But at the end of the day, like, most of these companies have like real ethos around putting the patient first and helping actually like give as many people access to these treatments. So it kind of aligns really nicely.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of setting North Stars. I think it just helps bring focus when often there's just a lot of noise around you as well. So
yeah, for
great
sure.
advice. Awesome. So we're going to shift over to audience Q&A. So again, thank you to all of you that have already submitted questions. We're just going to pick out a handful and just kind of mindful of time as well. So there's actually a comment, a link to the pitch would be great. Please and thank you. So again, as I mentioned, I will share a link to Manuri's pitch from TechCrunch Battlefield into the show notes, just to will be available at startupplaybook.co when this episode goes live on Thursday. The first question that we have is from Vivian Vo, who says, what challenges did you face when you first started HealthMatch? How have you been able to find the right partners to grow it?
I think the biggest challenges I faced was not coming from sort of a tech or startup world, trying to understand how to actually sort of build a company or articulate a problem and sort of run the process of building a prototype and an MVP. And I think the best way that I overcame that problem was really finding people in industry. So other founders that I spoke to who were like 3 or 4 steps ahead of me, that could kind of give me insight into what they did and how they approached, building a prototype or doing their first capital raise, which is really helpful. And then, trying to read as many books that people in this space have written. So like, I really love Ben Horowitz's Hard Thing About Hard Things, and Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, and there's quite a few resources out there now. Like, and even if you jump on Twitter and you follow like newsletters and substacks that like people write, it's really helpful just to share that knowledge and that knowledge sharing that exists amongst people that have done it before.
Fantastic. And I think we've got time for one more question. So submitted by an anonymous attendee. And I think this is in reference to the hiring process. So how do you put together a short list of candidates to interview, and what are some of the things someone should do when applying for a job at HealthMatch?
I think, sort of putting a short list together it's a bit of a process. Like, part of it is weighing previous experience with the role and looking for experience that would help in the phase that we're at. So, if we're hiring our first hire in a particular category, I like to see that they've, been able to build and implement something before from scratch, versus if you're building, if you're hiring someone within an already sort of established, like, within the growth team or within engineering, it's kind of different. So there's an element of like looking at CVs and sort of applications that come in. But I think really important is, I love when there are cover letters or people write about like why they sort of align with the mission and what we're building and want to be part of building this product and platform and sort of delivering it to the world. And then also what they can offer HealthMatch from that perspective. What unique insights can they bring? Like, what are they going to do that like helps add to our, like, you know, our company, our product, our culture, whatever that is. Yeah, I really love it when people write cover letters. I know it seems really old school, but it helps give a bit of insight into their thinking.
Fantastic. Like we mentioned earlier, I think you'll be going on a bit of a hiring spree, so I'll make sure that I add a link to your careers page onto the show notes for this episode. Once again, a big thank you to everyone that tuned in live. And Manuri, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing your experience and insights.
No, thanks very much for having me. It was a great chat.
Thank you. And congratulations once again on your new cap raise as well. Very exciting times ahead for HealthMatch.
Thanks, Rohit. Appreciate it.
Cheers. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to episode 136 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. This will be the last interview for 2020, and I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for tuning into the show this year. I really appreciate you taking the time to download and listen to the show every single week. I hope all of you and your families have a wonderful holiday season, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all again in the new year with some more amazing guests. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I will see you all in 2021.